Hi guys, time for chapter 15 of The River. I apologize for not getting one up yesterday, but we're jumping right in today. Time was everything. Once the decision was made, time was vital. But Brian took a minute to scan the map once more and do some mental calculating. And it didn't come up too terrible. Say it was 100 miles by river. When they landed, they'd come down next to where the river left the lake, and Brian had watched the current as it flowed away. It seemed to move about as fast as a person walked, maybe 3 miles an hour. Of course, that didn't mean it would continue to flow at that speed, but it would probably be about the same. If he could get into the current and move with it and stay with it, 100 miles would take 35 or 40 hours. He studied it closer on the map and noted that it grew wider as it flowed and that in some places it moved through hilly country. There were contour lines on the map closer together, which meant steeper hills. Here, the current might even be a little faster. A day and a half, he thought. Then he said it aloud to Derek. A day and a half. A long day and a half, but if we keep moving, stay in the river, and don't stop, we should make the trading post in a day and a half. Maybe 2 days. And that, he thought without saying, is a lot better than 7 or 8. A lot better than dying. There were 2 places. The river ran into lakes and out the other end, and many smaller ponds and what might be swamps where the river moved through a center of a small body of water. They would slow him down. He could not judge how much, but none of them were large, and if he stayed on the edge and used a pole, he should be able to keep moving well enough to not lose too much time. Time. He was sitting, reading, looking in the map, and there wasn't time for it. He needed to build a raft. He checked Derek once more, made certain his breathing was regular and that his heart was beating steadily, and then he moved off down the side of the lake looking for wood. The problem was not wood so much as the lack of a tool. When he'd made the raft before to go out to the plain, he'd had his hatchet, and he missed it terribly now. After he'd been rescued and gone home, his mother had put the hatchet back in a glass case in the living room, where she kept the china handed down by her grandmother. He'd looked at it as he left home, but they had decided that having a hatchet might not be realistic. Lots of people carry a knife of some kind, Eric had said, but how many have a hatchet on their belt? So all he had was a knife. Well, 2 knives, actually. He had Derek's knife as well. He'd almost forgotten that. But even 2 knives wouldn't help cut through logs. There was wood all over the place. Windstorms over the years had knocked down pines and spruce trees, and many of them were the right diameter to use for making a raft, 6 or 8 inches and straight, but they were for the most part too long or still connected to the root structure, which made them impossible to use. But Brian moved along the lake, up from the shore and back, and finally found a stand of large poplars where beavers had been working. He knew almost nothing of beavers, except that they lived in the water, chewed trees down, and looked cute when he saw them swimming in the water. Except for pictures, he'd never seen one on dry land, but he'd seen how they took trees down. And this stand of poplars was a good example. In a 100-yard circle, there was a tree standing. There were pointed stumps everywhere with tooth marks on them, and dropped trees fallen across each other so thickly it looked like giants had started to play pickup sticks and walked away before finishing the game. The beavers had been working at the grove for some time, probably years, and they'd not only dropped the trees, many of them the right diameter, but they had cut the limbs off and dragged them down the pathways to the lake and cut some of the tree trunks in sections between 8 and 10 or 12 feet long, apparently to make them easier to move. It's like I hired them, Brian thought, looking at all the fallen poplars. Just cut them down for me? The older trees, which had been cut down a year or 2 before, were well dried out, and when Brian rolled and skidded them down to the lake, he found they floated well. 4 of them, side by side, held him up easily when he used his arms to hold them together and crawled on top. He got wet, but they held him. Of course, Derek was a lot heavier than the 2 of them together still, but 8 or 10 of them should do it, and there were many the right size and length. He had only to select the ones he wanted. He worked hard for a solid half hour and ran to check on Derek. He was still the same, and Brian jogged back to the beaver's woodyard. He picked 8 logs, each running close to 8 inches thick and roughly 8 feet long. He selected the driest ones he could find, going by feel. He'd learned that from the firewood. The drier, the lighter. The wood was soft, felt soft to the point of his knife, and he thought that it might mean they could waterlog, but then he decided it wouldn't matter. It would take weeks or at least days to soak into an 8-inch log, and he wouldn't need the logs that long. One way or the other, he thought while dragging the first log down the lake. The beavers had left clear sliding trails where they had dragged branches down to the lake, and Brian used one of them, the main trail, to pull the logs down. The last 4 feet of the water were fairly steep, and the mud was slick from the recent rain, and the logs pretty much made their own way to the lake, pushing him ahead down towards the water. He had a plan, or as much of a plan as he could have for what he was going to try to do. He couldn't move Derek very far by mere strength. He had to weigh close to 180 pounds compared to Brian's 140. Brian couldn't carry him and could only drag him a short distance. So he had to bring the raft to just below the shelter, bring the raft to Derek. And that meant building it here and working it up the side of the lake to Derek. It took him less than an hour to get all the logs down to the water. And when he laid them side by side and lined the ends together, he was pleased to see they made a usable looking raft. The ends weren't quite even, but close, and they were pointed the way the beavers had chewed them off. It gave them kind of a streamlined look. Like something out of Huckleberry Finn, he thought, except that nothing held them together yet. Brian stood next to them in knee-deep water and studied the problem. He had no rope, no string, and yet he had to have a way to hold the logs in a flat platform to keep them solid enough to carry Derek and him. He had his clothing, his jacket, the same type of windbreaker he'd had when he had to survive the first plane crash, and he had Derek's jacket as well, though Brian wanted to keep that for cover for Derek. But even cutting the jacket in strips might not make enough roping to tie all the logs together. He cast around, looking for vines or grasses he could weave into a rope. But again, beavers helped him. They had also cut smaller sticks, limbs and the tops of trees, some of them 5 or 6 feet long and 2 or 3 inches in diameter. They provided his answer. He made cross pieces with them, put one on top and one on bottom, and sandwiched the raft body logs in place. Then he cut strips from his jacket and tied the 2 cross pieces together at the ends so that they were pulled together and held the logs firmly in place. By using his knife to notch the cross pieces to take the material, he made sure the cloth tie-downs didn't slip off. He put 4 of these cross members down the length of the raft, tying them in place as tight as he could get them. And when he was done, the raft was stout enough for him to stand on, jump on, walk back and forth on. It was about 8 feet long, 5.5 feet wide, and floated well out of the water, and had not taken him more than 2 hours to build. He'd gone back twice to check on Derek while working, and now that it was finished, he cut a long pole for pushing the raft and used his knife to carve a crude paddle, then moved back to the camp before bringing the raft. He was not hungry, still felt too nervous for hunger, but he knew he should eat before they started, or he would be too weak. So he ate nuts and some berries that they had stored in a birch bark cone, ate everything he found in the shelter, they wouldn't need it on the run, and examined Derek closely one more time while he ate. The whole thing, he knew, was crazy and had only a small working. He knew that. He understood that. If there was one thing he understood about working in an emergency, surviving, it was there was a large measure of luck involved. And if there was the slightest, tiniest change in Derek, any indication at all that he was coming out of it, Brian would call the whole trip off and just hope for the best. So he studied Derek, worked at it as hard as he could. He looked into the unconscious man's eyes and saw nothing, just the glazed look that was there before. He carefully measured his breathing and his heartbeat and found them to be the same, exactly the same as they'd been since he started to keep track of them. He yelled into Derek's ear, looking for some reaction in his eyes, and there was no sign of anything he could hear or that he could react to hearing. Finally, he tried pain. He used the tip of his knife to poke Derek's hand, again, watching the man's eyes, and there was simply nothing, even when he poked hard enough to draw a small drop of blood. No sign of any kind of life or knowledge except the breathing and the heartbeat. Then he waited a few minutes and did it all again, working steadily, carefully, and it was the same. He had to be certain, absolutely certain there was no choice. And he was. He stood and looked across the lake and felt strangely old. It was his decision to make, and yet Another man could die because of what he decided. He had never been in this position, and it frightened him. Even when he was in danger, even when he had to fight just to live, his decisions had only ever affected him, not another person. And now Derek lay there, and Brian looked down to where he'd pulled the raft to the shore by the shelter and opened his mouth and said, "We go." It came out as a whisper. Right or wrong, they had to do it. Brian had to do it. Please, God, he thought, and didn't finish. Just that. Please, God. He turned to face Derek and coughed and said it again, loud and clear. "We go."